Thank you. First of all, I would like all thank you for coming here, despite the early morning. I know it's hard. I'm very happy to see all of you coming. And my name is Borys-Piątkowska, and I'm currently working as a senior narrative designer and senior writer at the Flying Wild Hog studio. I was responsible for creating the whole story and the character design and dialogue writing in Evil West and Shadow Warrior 3. Before I moved to Flying Wild Hog, I worked at CI Games studio, where we did the Sniper series. In my free time, as a hobby, I do role-playing games. I was responsible for translating the core book for the Call of Cthulhu 7th edition at the Polish market. And I'm also a member of the Women in Games Society. I'm an ambassador. I do recommend all the ladies, and not only, to follow this page. As I said, I'm a narrative designer and writer, which can look actually like this in practice. We're going to start with some kind of metaphor of dream selling, as I like, and I will explain later how it works in my thesis. Then we're going to move to the difference, the meaningful difference between the narrative and plot, which is very important considering the topic. And then we're going to delve into the writer function and narrative designer function, because these are two separate functions as I want to develop this thesis. And in the end, I will come up with a conclusion, and I hope it will help you maybe develop a better understanding of what narrative is, why do you need a narrative designer in your teams, and actually what is the narrative design in general. And of course, bibliography, which is very important. Okay, so, or not so. The dream mongers, as I really like to call us, the devs, the people who create games, because we're getting those dreams of the players. We are getting and gathering their fantasies, and we promise to deliver to them the fantasy of being some sort of a superhero or any character they want to be, right? So we are building the narrative, the settings around, the elements that actually create this very fantasy, right? Players are dreamers, and we construct those dreams, and we deliver sort of their dreams as best as we could, as we know. So we make these dreams just happen, right? And writers are the people who actually turn those fantasies into words. And to focus on the difference between the narrative designer and the writer, we need to start from the beginning, because it's very important to differentiate these two functions. Whenever I participate in recruitment sessions, or I talk to people, a lot of people treat the narrative designers simultaneously as writers. They use those two terms, writer and narrative designer, interchangeably, which is kind of wrong, because of course, one person can be both the writer and narrative designer, depending on the stage of the game creation, but their responsibilities, depending on the stage of the creation, is different. A narrative designer has different responsibilities, and the writer has different responsibilities, and it actually comes out from a very, very simple and very basic difference between the narrative and the plot, because the plot is the main, actually the sequence of the main events, of the events that happen. And in a product, in a novel, in a film, in a game, as we say right now, and narrative design is the set of all those events, the method, the way of presenting it, the whole set of rules, the guidelines that actually are attached to the sequence of events. So the method of presenting it. In Polish, narracja. In English, narration is something different. It's another topic, so let's stick to the narrative design, which was actually established to say in general, in a holistic way, about the whole setting and the set of rules that actually is attached to the plot and to the story. So these are separate specializations. Again, one person can be both narrative designer and writer, which is very, very often, and it happens very often, especially in our Polish market, in Polish companies, but also throughout the world, as I know from experience. But this is a very simple and very, I think, very clear difference, the way of presenting the difference between the narrative designer and writer. I stole it from Molly Maloney, so forgive me for I sinned, but it's for the sake of spreading the good word. I really recommend you to follow Molly Maloney, because she's a brilliant lecturer, brilliant narrative designer and writer, and she established two theses that I very much like about this very difference. So the narrative designer is responsible for a player in the story, and writer is responsible for a character in the story. So we have this common thing, the story. We have the character who has his own or her own motivations, goals to achieve, and the narrative designer takes care of the player to find himself understanding the story and the motivation of the characters. It doesn't mean the player has the same motivation. Player has to understand why the character is doing it, and why he wants to achieve his goal, and to understand his motivation. He has to know why is he doing what he's doing as a character. So, to sum up, what is a writer? I will shed a light on a couple of examples, what a writer does and what not. And of course, you will see some kind of similarities between the responsibilities of the narrative designer and writer. As I said, it's somehow the thing that those topics can be covered up by one person and one person who actually does those both functions, but these functions are different. So what is a writer? In general, the main responsibilities and the main requirements. So he or she writes the plot. She or he is responsible for creating believable characters, making the story arcs, making the character arcs. They write all the dialogues and all in-game texts, which is also connected with creating the localization doc, which is lockkit, the so-called. So the localization doc consists of all the text that are presented in the game, in either way, both in text or by the voiceover. They, of course, are supervising, and I dare to say they should be supervising, because it's not that common. But I think they should be supervising the voiceover recording sessions, because they need to know how the actors work with their lines that they actually have written. And also, they should be present at the mocap sessions just to make sure the context of the scene that is directed during the mocap is done properly, right? And according to the context, so that the writer could answer some doubts or questions of the animators that are responsible for the mockups. They also can supervise, not only, maybe not that common is for the writer to work in the engine, like implement himself or herself the dialogue texts within the engine. But to supervise it, to play the game and check whether it's proper place or not, it's also the responsibility, should be the responsibility of the writer. Localization doc, as I said, this is a very brilliant tool. Of course, it's a topic for another lecture, but it's connected very, very closely to the writer and narrative designer. So, believable characters, the storyline, the plot, the story arcs, the character arcs, everything connected to the character. And what is a narrative designer? Wait, in practice. I just wanted to show you how it works actually when it comes to summing up the writer work. Is it going to be played or no? No? Okay. So, I can briefly explain you. It doesn't work? I can briefly tell you what actually I was going to show you here. Detroit Become Human. The title, actually, most of you probably know. And we have this relationship between Connor and Hank, which is kind of severe. At the beginning, they are slowly getting along during the game. And Connor is I'm going to spoil, but this game has some years, so it's not that a spoiler. He's an android. And the androids are not so accepted in this world because something wrong is happening within the world of the androids and the role of the androids in the Detroit setting. Hank is a policeman. They are investigating a crime scene. Hank is not eager to work and talk to Connor at the beginning. And this is actually the part where Connor enters the crime scene and a policeman says, you're not allowed to be here. And Hank says to the policeman, it's all right, it's with me. Meaning and referring to the android who is Connor, but Connor is a character, right? And this actually, I'm not saying that Detroit is written best, but it has, yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay. Well, let's get it just, a couple of seconds, so it's fine. If you play it, I will be glad. You will check if I explained it properly. Wait for it. Maybe I should voice over. No? Okay, no problem. So, you have to trust me. And it actually means that, Hank, in this very line, this very pronoun, it refers to Connor, and it says that he's accepting it, but very hardly, and he's actually harsh about the relationship and their cooperation. And this is in practice, right? I repeat, I don't find Detroit being written very well, but it has their moments, and I think this is one of the best lines. And moving on to the narrative designer. What is a narrative designer? No, separate functions. Remember that. And this is why. Scope of responsibilities, as I said, it can be similar. Some topics can cover up by both those functions, but the main difference is that I like to call a narrative designer a bridge between the story design, the writers, and other departments of design. He is or she is a person who translates story into gameplay, who works very closely to the writers, with the writers, and translates their language, the story language, the plot language, the character language, the reason and outcomes of the plot, of the storyline, into other departments of design. So, of course, the narrative designer participates in the creation of the plot, in the creation of characters. He's aware of what is happening, event by event, in the sequence of the story of the plot presented in the game. But his or she is also responsible for creating the whole kind of narrative. So this set of rules, the set of elements that create the story, right? The mood, the environment, the dialogue mechanics, so that the player will understand better what is going on and why the character is doing this or that, and what methods of communicating this story, of delivering the story, the player, the designer has to show and to the player and to teach him how to use it and why actually this one mechanic is the most appropriate, right? Besides the production and technical values. So he's responsible, the narrative designer is responsible for giving a mood of the environment storytelling. It doesn't mean that he is actually distributing all the assets of level art, all the implementing all the mechanics or even combat dialogues during the combat, right? Because they are conditioned. It means that he or she is taking care of the mood, of the vibe, of the vision of the level within the very context of the story presented, right? So that the player will not be confused and will understand the progress of story in every level. The narrative designer, as opposed to the writer sometimes, very often I say, he's also responsible for implementing in the engine the dialogue lines connected with the story. Again, it doesn't mean he has to implement and attach the dialogue lines to different NPCs during the combat, but he can distribute all around the level the story dialogues, right? The one-liners, some kind of barks or other things connected with the plot, the collectibles, the pawns that maybe are a point of interest for the player and they talk to the player, right? So every element of the story which is delivered to the player. So they are also supervising it. The narrative designer plays this game, plays this story, and understands it. Understand how to put it right to make the player also understand the progress of the plot of the story throughout the levels. I like to say that a narrative designer uses story as a tool. He actually manages to talk to the other designers, to give them the context of the story, to make them happen, make them those elements of the story be alive in the levels, so that the whole storyline is not a separate part of the gameplay, right? Because very often it happens that there's a story and there's the gameplay, and these are two separate things. And the narrative designer is the one who knows the story well, from the beginning up till the end, and he can say any moment, any event that is actually played during the game on every level. And it's very, very important to, as a writer, create a consistent and coherent story, and as a narrative designer, to take care of this coherence of the story within the levels, so that the player, again, I will repeat, understand what is going on and why is it going on. In practice, again, nope. Are we going to have a chance? Yep. And it doesn't need the sound. Fair point. Okay. So again, you have to trust me. What I can tell you, I just recommend to put it on your YouTube after the lecture and just see. This is a tiny story, as you see, narrative design, but something that will tell you more about the details about the narrative designer. So he actually creates the whole elements of the story and put it in motion, put it in action, and make this story, which is written on paper, into life, into the levels, into the experience, right? I also like the term that a narrative designer uses the story to make it a story experience, to make the player experience the story and the plot. If you're interested after the lecture, please follow on Facebook this tiny story film and just make familiar yourself with it. So, this is why I think that if we sum it up, we can say that not only a narrative designer does what I actually I'm saying what he or she is doing, right? The quest designers, the game designers, and all the designers are actually responsible for making this happen and making this story coherent and playable for the player. So that's why I think a narrative designer is a fully fledged designer, right? He is a part of the design. And that's why he's a bit different from the writer, because he's this bridge. He's the one who works more with the writers and the designers, and he translates this story language into the design, and he's not a separate part, because sometimes the writers are working remotely, right? And they are not the part of the team. They are not engaged in the process of making the designs, the process of talking about and discussing about the mechanics needed and necessary for the player to understand the story. And narrative designer is the one who actually glues those things together. And he's very important, not only because of the things that he can do both on paper and in engine, but also as a part of the communication between the departments, which is, as we all know, the most important thing during the game creation, which is communication, right? Between the departments. So, the story should be coherent and, of course, playable. The writer and the narrative designer, the design team, which actually consists of all the elements that create a story. So this is this very narrative. And that's why I think we can sum it up in those two parts of those chunks, just to make sure you understand what I'm going to say and what I'm delving in. So gameplay, what is the player doing? Story, why is the player doing? And narrative designer, as I said, summing it up, understanding the player's action, and writer, understanding the character's actions. I hope you won't feel like the guy in the corner right now. If you have any questions more, find me outside the lecture. But before, I promised you a conclusion. And when it comes to creating the game content, I think after taking into consideration all I said about the narrative design in whole, in general, I think that we all are the people, the creators of the narrative, no matter what actually department we are representing, right? Because not every game, as you see, needs a plot, but every game is actually a part and consists of the narrative, has a narrative, right? Even clicker games, as you see, it actually promises some sort of dream, this kind of fantasy, right? If I dream of being a ninja who cuts the fruits in halves and maybe put it on pizzas, that's also a narrative. I don't need a plot. I don't need the set of events that actually create some plot twists or very fantastic dialogues or something. This is a narrative. This is the set of elements that create this dream, this fantasy, right? So in the big picture, I think that we all devs, we all are the creators of the narrative. We are all the narrative designers, and whether or not the writer wants to be or doesn't want to be a narrative designer, he, in some sort of way, he is a narrative designer, as actually a part of the team of the design, because narrative is not only a plot, right? We all lived together. We are a part of the team that work on the narrative. So when selling this dream, when selling this fantasy, we all want to answer the best way as we could to the player's dream and needs, right? So in case of story, we should answer the question if it stayed true to the promised dream. Let's think of a Spider-Man, right? We have this fantasy of being a Spider-Man. So the Spider-Man, it's not only a story that a player dreams of, right? He wants to be a a Spider-Man. He wants to fly between the buildings. He wants to use his spider senses. He wants to stick to the building walls and fly between them and fight the groups of criminals, right? So, as a part of the design, we want to deliver this dream. So, as an environment artist, I need to make sure that my Spider-Man would fly between those buildings in real, right? So we need to build those skyscrapers that allow the player, the character player, to fly between those walls. As a programmer, I need to do a code that allows the player to use those mechanics of senses. As an animator, I am making this Spider-Man fly smoothly. I am making this, this whole concept of being a spider and moving smoothly thanks to the code that the coder will bring me, right? But as an animator, I take care of the things of the narrative that enable to use the movements of Spider-Man, right? The whole thing with the mechanics of the senses. So the game designers are responsible for delivering the mechanics that are a part of this fantasy of being a Spider-Man. And as a writer, I am responsible for giving a good story, right? But there can be a hell of a stories in the Spider-Man world, right? So the setting, the dream, this is all the narrative. This is all the set of elements that create this fantasy and actually consists of the narrative. And this is the narrative. This is the creation of the narrative. Bibliography, because I think this is it. I hope I met the expectations, and I hope it's gonna make you or just help you understand better what a narrative is and why do you need a narrative designer. I always recommend Ivan Skolnick. He's a very good narrative designer and writer, and also a very talented writer of guidebooks. Kind of like the Christopher Booker thing, 7 Basic Plots. I was looking for the cover. It's more connected with the film screenwriting, but also a couple of basics from the screenwriting. It's also useful when creating the narrative, the story, writing the plot, also, of course, in the games. Yeah, and I think that's it. Thank you for surviving with me, even without the films. I hope I explained you much more from the Detroit.
Thank you very much, Maria. Do you have any questions for Maria?
With you pointing out that the narrative designer being part of the design team and then the writer being responsible for characters and so on, but also the roles of the narrative designer and the writer overlapping a lot, the same person's doing it. How do you sometimes, I don't know, I guess, detach from one to do the other, right? And then swap between those, because I feel like it's something you need to do.
This is a perfect question. I mean, this is a question for another lecture, but I will try to be brief. I think it depends, because I'm working both of those two functions, right? It depends on the stage of the project. As a writer, I am mostly engaged in writing at the beginning, when the screenplay actually happens, when we are in the process of writing everything on paper. And it's very good to have it on paper and just delete all of the things that are not connected or just you know don't work, right? And this is easy, but I feel the need to be a narrative designer, and I know I'm doing the narrative designer right now when I take those papers or Google Notes or anything, and I put it in the game and I play it. So when on paper, I will write some dialogues, for example, a cutscene, right? And I have my characters, they are also well written, let's say, and I have those dialogue lines, and I think, okay, I think they are great. I think they're fit. And then I'm gonna to voice record it, and then, as a narrative designer, I implement those one-liners during the game, during the level. And this is where my narrative design happens, right? Because I need to I need to play this game to make sure that the context is fine, because the levels are changing. During the whole era of production of the game, we all know that the game that we are doing at the beginning is not the same game at the end of the process of production, right? And this is tricky. So I need to make sure that if the level changes, the lines will also change. Whether it depends on, moving it to the beginning of the level or the end of the level, or just cancel it because it doesn't make sense anymore because the context is different. So as a writer, I'm writing it on paper and I think, okay, this will work. And as a narrative designer, I have to check it. And I have to be sure that if I put this line here, I will make the player understand why the character is saying it in this very moment. So it depends on the stage of production. When I enter the engine, I know I'm a narrative designer of some kind, right? Of course, we can argue right now that if we sit at the table, by the table with other departments and we are discussing the mechanics, right? Also the narrative mechanics, like dialogue delivering mechanics. It's also a part of my narrative design. When I think how to make the player understand and how to deliver to the player my story that I wrote, and when I think about the methods and ways of delivering it, it's actually a part of narrative design. When I think of moods and environment, things that are on the level that will be visible, this is also part of the narrative design. So everything that the player will see and experience. This is my time when I'm a narrative designer. It wasn't brief, sorry.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. My question is, if you are a writer, a novel writer, you create literature, you are a character designer, a world builder, set dresser, choreographer if you do fight scenes, stuff like that. You are God, basically. But when you come to gaming, as you said, it's a group effort. You are a part of the team. So my question is, does the background in literature help writers in game dev, or is it a problem?
Another perfect question. Both ways, actually. On one hand, it helps. On the other hand, it doesn't. Why? Because the basics, that's why actually I showed you the bibliography, the book from the screenwriting, film screenwriting. It actually should be not connected in some way because it's not an interactive medium. But the basics, when you have those basics, you you have the advantage of thinking out of the box somehow, because you know the basics and you can experiment with those basics on different medias. It's like Quentin Tarantino, right? Actually my student asks me, okay, I will do the Pulp Fiction. And I say, okay, but learn the basics first. Tarantino knows the basics, and then he started experimenting, right? So this is the moment when you have all the tools that you know, and you can select which tools are necessary and useful in this very moment when creating the game. This is cool. This is a very good advantage, and if you're experienced in that, it's something that is your actually forte, right? Because you can learn and you can look for appropriate answers in a vast, bag of tools that you actually learned already, right? What about the other hand, which is why not? Because sometimes you are very used to some methods and solutions. You are, as a writer, I graduated also from the film school, and I know that from experience that when I stick to some kind of basics of film writing, I will, be focused on those solutions because I know they work. They work. And okay, they work, but in film. And what about the game industry when this is, as you said, the group effort, and the worst thing in games is the players. So it's, yeah, a joke, of course, but actually we are fulfilling their dreams, right, anyway. So sometimes you are blinded by those basics that you know they work because they were working through all the, epoch in the past, the 100 years. but this is an interactive medium, and you have to know when to put the button delete. As a writer, especially in game industry, the delete button is the most used button on your keyboard. And this is not a joke, right? Because I've got a question from my students in the film school. They ask me, okay, so how many iterations of the screenplay you have in the game industry when you are making a game? Because in filmmaking, maybe there are 2 or 3, depending on the humor of the director. And I said, oh Jesus, there are hundreds of iterations of the whole screenplay, not only one level. So it needs you to think more to be more open. When you know those basics, you know they are right, you can select them, but you have to be open for changes that maybe in this very medium, the interactive medium, this is not a good way to deliver it to the player, because it's different. You're not a reader, you're not a film taker, you're a player. You want to experience, and sometimes it's the thing that you have to just omit those obstacles, even though you know they are working, right? It's all about reason and reasonable usage of it. Sorry, yeah.
Thank you very much.
I
Give a round of
briefing.
applause for Maria.
Thank you very much.